Okay, so that's just a very brief introduction to phenomenology. I want to talk about intentionality next.
Before going to the next topic, I gave some kind of, and also Melanie also gave some kind of research project where it starts from some kind of like visual illusion, where subjective feeling about the illusion is only accessible through the subject reports, and then try to correlate what's happening in the brain, and try to also characterize this kind of transition probability and so on through the experimental psychology.
Yeah.
Is it fair to say that that kind of approach of a consciousness science is already doing this kind of triangulation, or is there something missing?
Well, I would say in most cases, when let's say you set out to do an experiment, and you say, oh, I want to study consciousness, then one question has to do with, well, what the meaning of what it is that we're studying. What is it that we're actually studying, and do we have good descriptions of what we're actually studying? Where do we get those descriptions from? Sometimes we go back to previous experiments, right, older science, but then that's pushing the question back a bit, and the question is somehow, how do we make sure that we have a good sense of the thing we're trying to explain? A lot of times, it seems to me anyway, reading some experiments, that a lot of the concepts that are being investigated are based on a kind of folk psychology, or kind of ordinary, everyday understanding of what we mean by these things and how they work, and then we test out that ordinary understanding. But you're using concepts and distinctions and insights that are kind of commonsensical in a certain way, which of course is part of how we go about learning about things. So what if we had a method to actually kind of control for that, to actually provide insights, distinctions, and say precisely what it is that we're looking at, what kinds of things are involved in when we're talking about memory or consciousness or that type of thing. And to me, that's where phenomenology comes in. It at least gives us some kind of description to start with, and sometimes you don't see that clearly mapped out in the experimental literature. So we're kind of think we're making progress sometimes, but then sometimes we just run into, we're trying to say what we're doing here, but then we're not quite understanding each other because the concepts are not clear. So I guess that's the way I would try to respond. But then we'd have to sit down and look at the details of, examples of experiments and so on.
Very briefly, if you think about special relativity, and I give examples from physics and what's used to that. Special relativity, why was it so difficult to discover it? It turned out that to do special relativity, space and time were mixing. If you go very fast, space contracts and time becomes slower. So if you assume that you can start with space and time as given, you can never discover special relativity. So if you assume that the brain generates consciousness, it may be correct, it may very well be correct, but if you assume the brain generates consciousness, you also assume a model of the brain, and your model is probably not correct, because your model is evolving. So if you assume that there is space and time, according to Newton, you can never discover what electromagnetism does at high speed. So if you assume that there is a brain the way you understand it right now, you may not be able to really get further to completely new insights in consciousness. So what Einstein did is to purely look at the phenomenology. In that way, I think it is a good way of the use of the word phenomenology. What happens if you write a light beam at the speed of light and forget about the nature of space and time? And then, to his own surprise, he realized the nature of space and time was different than everybody thought. So maybe if we look at consciousness purely as consciousness and we try to intrinsically discern what can we really say about consciousness qua consciousness as consciousness, maybe we can get a hint of some wrong assumption which we have about the brain. It's not saying that we are idealists, it's not saying that we don't believe in brains, But by temporarily setting aside our understanding of the brain, we might be able to overcome a mistake that everybody makes, like everybody was a Newtonian before Einstein, and get to the next step. I don't know whether this is helpful.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's right.
Talk.
Okay, so phenomenology is an attempt to identify kind of invariant characteristics of consciousness. I refer to the structures of consciousness. I hope that'll become clear as we go on. So one thing that we look at and find as part of consciousness is this notion of phenomenality, which I think we've been talking about to some extent. The phenomenal aspects of consciousness, the qualia, if you will. There's something it is like to be conscious, right? This is something I'll talk about later, but there's another element here that came up in questions about what are we talking about? Intentionality is another aspect of consciousness, which someone, I think, you nicely, the phenomenological formula is almost, to be conscious is to be conscious of something. It's about the directionality, let's say, of consciousness, or it's the aboutness. What am I conscious of? When I believe something, what am I believing about? What is this thing? And this notion of intentionality has a long history. Actually, you can trace it back through Aristotle to Empedocles. But Brentano is sort of the kind of turning point in modern psychology and philosophy. In the 19th century, Brentano kind of pulled it up out of the medieval discussion and started to talk about it in more modern terms. And Husserl learned from Brentano about intentionality and then made some revisions to Brentano's notion. So we want to talk, first of all, about intentionality. We'll come back to phenomenality. And there's also another part of this that has to do with what we might call a self structure. The idea that if there is experience, there is someone who is experiencing, or there's something that is experiencing. So consciousness always involves some kind of self-awareness. This is a claim that we want to look at, and that's what we'll be doing when we look at this notion of pre-reflective self-awareness. But first of all, let's talk about intentionality. So we could sort of write it as a statement and say, I am conscious of something. That's probably a true statement for everyone right now in the room, assuming that we're all conscious. You're conscious of something, me maybe up here, or maybe you're thinking about your next meal, so you're conscious of something, some imaginary meal that you're yearning for or whatever. So if we look at that type of statement, we can say there's one part of it that seems to indicate this type of self-structure that I just mentioned. People sometimes talk about ego. That's a kind of old word now. It's a Latin word, which means I, or the self. So that's one piece of the structure of intentionality, let's say. And then there is the idea of the consciousness of. And there, of course, we have different ways to be conscious of things. So we might be perceiving in some fashion, or we might be remembering or imagining something. We might be judging something, or desiring something, or believing something, or loving something. Emotions also have this kind of structure. Loving or hating something. And in that sense, that's something about consciousness, that it has those kinds of things going on. And then there is the something that you are conscious of, and that always seems to be involved in consciousness. This is usually called the intentional object, right? So we're talking about intentionality, the consciousness of something, the something, which might be an apple tree out there in the world, is the intentional object that we are conscious of. So this, I'm going to also give you some more technical terminology here from the phenomenology, but yes.
So the intentional object should always be outside from your mind?
We'll talk about that because it gets a little complicated if, for example, we're using memory or imagination. It might not be right outside of your mind. But we'll get to that in a second. So here's a technical term, comes from the Greek. Philosophers like to use a lot of Greek terms. Noesis is just the Greek term for thinking. So Husserl called this the noetic aspect of consciousness. We can think of it as, the cognitive state of perceiving or remembering or imagining. So this part here, the consciousness of, is this kind of noetic aspect of conscious experience. But then there is just this question that you raised about, well, if we're perceiving the apple tree, then right, we can think of this as kind of just a direct relationship to something outside there in the world. But it gets complicated if instead of perceiving, we're remembering or imagining something. So this is a problem that Brentano wrestled with. And taking this notion of intentionality from the medievals, he thought, in medieval philosophy, which is influenced by Aristotle, he thought that there was something in the mind. Aristotle would call it the form of the thing that we're experiencing. So this is the thing we're experiencing. We somehow rather pull the form of that, not the material, obviously, but the form of that thing, and one might say represent that thing in some way in the mind. So for Brentano, the intentional object actually was something inside the mind. It was what he called the intentional inexistence of the thing that we're conscious of. Husserl, however, rejected that, and he proposed another Greek term. This is the term noema, which means the thing that is thought about, from the Greek. And so he called this the noematic aspect. So now the question is, what does that mean? What exactly is that? And this is where there is some debate within the phenomenological tradition, precisely how we should interpret the noema, or the noematic aspect of consciousness. And here there is a debate that is often put in terms of the West Coast versus the East Coast interpretation, referring to the West Coast of the United States, California mainly, and the East Coast, Massachusetts and New York mainly, where the people are working. So let me just sort of give you a sense of what the debate is. So on the East Coast, we had one of Husserl's students, Aaron Gurvich, who came in the 1940s to teach at Brandeis and then the New School. He thought of the noema, he thought of this noematic aspect as perceptual, as really modeled on a kind of perception. And so he thought of it as being related to the perspectival aspects that we experience in our perception of something out there. And so he refers to it as how the object appears to me in my experience. So it's the appearance of the object. So you have an apple tree, let's say, out there in the world. That is what it is. But if I'm standing over here looking at it, I can only say I see one side of it or one profile of that apple tree. I don't see the other side of the apple tree, although I could move around to see that. But I never see the apple tree in its entirety. It always appears to me in a kind of perspectival way. All right, so perception, at least in that sense, is always in a certain way incomplete. And it's that aspect that I am able to experience that is what Gurvich would call the noema. On the West Coast, however, you had Forrestal, who was a fan of another philosopher who was a contemporary of Husserl, named Frege. And Frege made a distinction between meaning and reference, Sinn and Bedeutung in German. So the reference of something, if I'm talking about the apple tree or experiencing the apple tree, the reference involved is the apple tree itself. And the meaning is what that apple tree means to me, what its significance is for me. And what Follistal proposes, based not so much on the perceptual model, but more about, focused on judgment, where a judgment takes the form of proposition. I judge that the tree is out there or something like that. The noema is, for him, the propositional meaning of a judgment that we can make based on our experience. So it's, and this also is reflected in some of what Husserl says. Husserl refers to the noema as the meaning of the thing perceived. And the way that Follistal and the West Coast interpretation goes, it sort of amounts to the notion of a representation. Right? So there are debates. The East Coast people would say it's not a representation, it's just actually something relational with respect to how I'm experiencing that tree out there in the world. Here it looks more like it's something within the mind. It's specifically, however, not a thing, it's sort of the meaning that I'm experiencing when I see the tree. I myself prefer what I'll call the Memphis interpretation. This is something now that you won't find in the literature, but I'll propose it to you. And of course, you're probably wondering, what about Hawaii and Alaska? How do they fit into this? And I think that the Memphis interpretation does make use of these other elements of the states. But I think really the metaphor kind of breaks down at that point. So let me just go back to what we were looking at before. So we're talking about intentionality, which is consciousness of something. And we're trying to figure out what this noematic aspect it is. And one thing that we don't have on our little cartoon here yet is the fact that, of course, all of this is embodied in some fashion, right? The perceiver is an embodied perceiver. The person who's remembering or thinking or judging or whatever is obviously embodied and, let's say, situated. And that fact is what I sometimes refer to as has certain pre-noetic effects on our experience. So the fact that we're situated in a certain environment, the fact that we are embodied in a certain way, also comes along with the idea that the spatial perspective matters, and that would put us a little bit closer to the East Coast idea. But also there are certain You okay? I know this is shocking stuff. Be careful out there. It's dangerous. Yeah, right. There are also affective, so including emotional, but things like hunger and things like that come into have an effect on our perception of the world, for example, or the way we make judgments. I'll give you some good examples of that later. There are also practical interests. What do I want to do? Why am I looking at that apple tree? And what do I have in mind with respect to how I'm going to engage with it or act towards it? All of this sort of is kind of embodied and active type stuff that one can talk of. And if you take that perspective and ask, well, how does the nomadic, what's that look like in this kind of more embodied view, then I think you could actually think of the nomadic aspect as what Gibson calls the affordance. All right, if you're familiar with ecological psychology, an affordance is just, it's a relational thing. It has to do with how your body fits with the environment. A chair, for example, affords sitting, but only because I have limbs that bend in a certain way. and I'm of a certain size. So that chair doesn't afford any sitting to an elephant, right? But does to me. So the affordance is a relational thing. It's about what my body is like, but also what my practical interests are like. What do I want to do? What kind of skills I have. So if I see a sheer cliff on a mountainside, I might think, well, I could climb that, but only if I had the right skills, right? If I've been practicing and am in good enough shape and strong enough and so forth. Otherwise, it doesn't really afford me much if I don't have the skill for climbing, or if I'm disabled in some way. So this affordance is very much defined in terms of the relationship that I have to my environment. So we could think of the, I think, nomadic aspect of consciousness as reflecting that kind of affordance structure that is not something in consciousness or in the mind. It's not something objectively out there either, but it's sort of the relational aspect, which I think is part of what the intentionality of consciousness means. All right? Intentionality itself is a relational thing. I am conscious of something, and you have to include that whole structure in order to get the notion of intentionality.
As a mathematician, I'm quite interested in the orientation of the arrow. Because, for example, you see something. One natural interpretation is direct reverse arrow.
Yeah.
And also, but to see something with intention is this kind. It is natural.
Yeah.
Orientation arrow is that case.
Yeah.
But mathematically, for example, if you can consider some kind of functions, then at the same time, you can consider the mapping from the set of sets from subsets from subsets, so-called inverse image mapping.
Okay.
So if you can give some arrow, then as some by some interpretation, you can consider the reverse in meta or meta level. So maybe such form of reversing is makes sense to interpret your Memphis interpretation.
Right. So I added another arrow here going this way, right, which I didn't mention, but I take this to be a kind of two-way, relationship that can be characterized as dynamical in some way. So the enactivists talk about dynamical coupling with the environment. I mean, that's what I'm trying to get at there. But yeah, I mean, if you are a sophisticated user of arrows, then it might be, worth looking and seeing if you could get a better representation of that.